Hey everyone from URM. We're going to be looking at a couple of different ways to do Andrew Wade's DreamGate method in Studio One. I think one works better than the other, but we'll see when we get into it. First, I wanted to kind of demonstrate why this is something really useful to be able to use in a production. So when you're mixing drums, you want a really consistent sound from your kick and snare and your toms usually, so that you can get that good impact no matter how the drummer is hitting the skin, but you want it to sound real. Now, I've done a little bit of work here already. I've done these two methods on one of the top mics and my kick in mic I've made here. But we're just gonna mute those and use the samples I've already laid in right here. Now listen to how this sounds. This is how you would normally do it. I just added one-shot samples that I have to this kick track and this snare track. So yeah, pretty consistent. You can hear the attack, and if I take them out, kind of falls apart. I mean, the drums aren't quite as there, and that's just the original tracks. So either you would do some work to that, or you just lay in samples, right? Well, the issue comes up when you have more hits at once, and you can kind of tell this is a one shot. So listen to this ghost note section right here. Right, that's really ugly, and it's because even though the levels are changed for these ghost notes, it's the same one shot, so you can hear every single one of those samples, and it's just ugly. Using the DreamGate method, you can actually create a transient track that allows you to emphasize that attack without changing the sound of the drum. And while that's a little bit of work to do up front, it can be really useful because then you don't have this weird issue with the one shots sounding like they do, and you still get the sound of the drum. So let's mute our sample tracks and let's see what we can do with these transient tracks that I've made. I'm gonna select them both and bring them in and out. I've already EQ'd them a little bit. All right, so you can tell there's a big difference there. So the big difference is when you have a lot of hits. So let's listen to this section where there's a lot of kick. So the low one's not changing. All I did was I brought in a transient that has a little bit more of that top end in beefy punch to add onto the front end of the kick sound, and I didn't have to do wild EQ and get this really weird ringing out of it. I just have more emphasis, versus if I used a sample. Right, that's drastically changing the sound of the drum. So that sounds like the drum, but I've emphasized the impact. Likewise on the snare, if we listen to a section where there's ghost notes, for instance, there's a little weird editing in there because I didn't spend a lot of time on it, but you can hopefully hear there's a lot more of the real drum in there. You can tell that he's hitting the drum softer on the ghost notes than he is on those top end attacks. Versus if I used a sample, not only is the sound of the drum different now, but I mean, you can tell it's a one shot, and it's pretty ugly. So using the transient track actually just lets you get a little more impact on the front end, and we'll actually add a little bit of 3K to that and see what it does for us. Same section without it. It's a lot more impacts there, and all I did was add more to the transient. That's it. So let's look at how we can do this a couple different ways in Studio One. All right, so let's get started. We'll start looking at the kick. Now, I've pulled up Unvision's The Cycle, which is from the Portfolio Builder, which I believe you get free with Nail the Mix. And what they did here is they actually didn't record a kick track. They recorded a kick pad and the rest of the kit at the same time. So you only get MIDI for the kick and no audio. So what I've done is I've just created a bunch of tracks here using Superior Drummer. I've just used the stock avatar kit, and it's just a pretty standard, easy to use kick sound. And I've used the kick out, all the bleed mics, the overheads, and the rooms from the kit, just to make sure that it actually sounds like a real kick drum. And also went ahead and created a sample track from that. So we're just going to be using this to demonstrate one of the methods. And the first thing that you need to do is actually duplicate this track, complete, so that we have something to work from that isn't the original kick track. We'll just solo this for now. Now, as our friend Morton actually posted in the Private Producers Club pretty recently, you can do this with the strip silence method, which is what we're going to do here. So I'll just zoom in a little bit and open this strip silence dialog. Now, I've already had to play with this. But the easiest way to do this, and probably the quickest method, is actually to use strip silence in lots of silence mode. So we'll go ahead and set that up. I have it in lots of silence. There's a couple different extra parameters you need to tweak for this to work properly. Typically, when I'm using this, I have minimum length up at 1 second, but we're gonna have to pull it all the way down to the lowest it will go is 10 milliseconds. But I mean, if we could get it lower than that, it'd be nice, but we can't. So I'll have to pull that all the way down, and it's really important that we unlink the pre-roll, post-roll, and fade in, fade out times so that we can separate them. So we'll unlink that. I've already set a couple of these things up. You don't want any post-roll time because you're just getting the initial transient here. But you do want, because this is a kick drum, a little bit of time beforehand, like a trigger pad and post in Pro Tools. So we'll set that up for 5 milliseconds, which is the same amount of time we have for our fade-in time, which will create an auto fade at the beginning of each clip that it's about to create. And we're going to leave 20 milliseconds fade out. Well, it doesn't create a clip that is only 10 milliseconds long, and you'll see that in a second. But we do want to go ahead and create a fade at the end there. So we have all these settings. I'll select this clip, and we will go ahead and hit apply. And just like that, we have a bunch of clips, or events as they call them in Studio One. And if we zoom in, you can actually see, yeah, it's grabbed the transient and a little bit of the kick sound afterward. And that sounds a bit like this. Now the thing is, that's not just your transient. That's actually mostly the kick sound. So what we're going to have to do is bring those event sizes down a bit. And we'll do some editing here in a second to make them work a little better for us too. So what I'm going to do is just zoom into one where I can see the fades. Whoa. Really, really easily. And we'll go ahead and change this fade in with all of them selected to logarithmic fade in, or logarithmic, and change our fade out to exponential, just so we have the shapes in place. But I am actually going to change the event length here. I'm going to drag it right back to where the fade in and fade out meet. Whoa, too far. And you will see actually in Studio One, if you back this up too far, you'll actually end up changing the time of the fade in instead of actually backing up to it. So the protective fade doesn't exist in this method like it does in the Pro Tools method. But we'll get this to where it just about meets, and we pretty much just have fade in and fade out meeting in just the transient in here. Now this sounds like this. That's a lot closer to what we expect from the DreamGate method. So in a kind of a short way, this actually kind of works. But if you notice, there's a couple places in here where it creates false positives. Now that's a red flag. Now, since we shortened all the event lengths, those actually aren't going to make any noise, which is good. But they are there. And just because this was a track created from MIDI, that's not going to be an issue. But it's worth noting that those false positives are there, and we didn't get to control the exact length of all these events. And that's something we really, really want to do to make sure that we only have the transient. Using strip silence actually doesn't give you a specific event size that you can make. It just strips silence down to a certain amount of audio that it's going to leave back in there. Setting it to lots of silence cuts out a ton of the audio, but it also doesn't give you control over how much of the audio is left. It's just a lot of it's taken out. It's just a lot of silence that you put in there, which is why you have these false positives, these events that actually aren't doing anything for you. So that's not a perfect method, but it is going to give you a little bit of that transient sound that you can add back in. So for instance, that sounds pretty good. And this kick mic, it's a little bit long, so we will just solo them together. It helps a little bit, but what we're going to do is actually process this a little bit. So I'm just going to open this up. So we'll bring up the high end. So you got a really exaggerated high end and kind of a scooped low mid. So that hopefully will end up giving us a little bit of an attack to our sample. So let's just listen to the original. All right, and then we'll add this in. So that's helping a little bit. And all we did was add a little bit of transient to it with some high end, which is what we would have wanted to do to the kick mic anyway. So this is without. So that's getting us somewhere. But again, we didn't have a lot of control over this. Strip silence kind of just did what I was going to do, and then we moved on. So let's move down here and let's look at our snare mics instead. And these are all over the place because this is a real kit. If you listen to this, there's cymbal bleed in there, and there's this ghost note section, which, as we heard in the whole mix, doesn't sound that good with a sample on top. So let's make our own. That's got a dull attack on it, and it's got a lot of stuff going on here. Now, I'll use the strip silence method at first, just to show you what it does. And it's not exactly pretty. We got our settings already set up, so I'm just gonna apply. Now, look at this. All of these things capture way more than just the transient. And if we go over to the ghost note section, some notes are longer than others. And this actually sounds pretty much like what a gate would do, which is the exact reason we use this method, was to get away from what a gate sounds like. So that didn't really work. And there's a lot of more issues with false positives on the snare. It just doesn't work all that well. It's not very consistent. You don't have a lot of control over it. For instance, if I actually selected all of this and tried to drag the event size back like I did before to where the fade in and fade out meet, look what happened to the ghost notes. They're all but gone. So that doesn't really work. Instead, what we're going to do is actually the closest analog that I can come up with to the actual DreamGate method as told by Andrew Wade. We're going to use the audio bend feature here. Now, typically you would use this, like I have it set up, to quantize drums. But what we're going to do instead is use the transient detection to give us slice points and work from there, which is the exact same way that we use Beat Detective in Pro Tools. So let's go ahead and click Analyze and see how far that gets us. We may have to play with the threshold a little bit. All right. So far, most of our hits look like they're going to be there. And this is the most time-consuming thing because you are going to have to look through and make sure you got everything. So I see a couple missing hits here, so let's mess with the threshold. Get those back. And I can't get these, but my threshold's all the way up, so I worry about false positives later. So what I'm going to do is just listen a little bit and then add the hits in. So for instance, that's 4 hits. We're going to need those. So fortunately, these drums are already edited, so all I have to do is change my grid to 30 seconds, go in here, and add them on snap points. Pretty close. Just like that. All right, so I'm going to add these bend points and come back when we are finished. All right, so I've cleaned up the transient points. And now we're going to actually go up here and look at the audio bend bar because we want this not to be set up like quantizing drums. We don't want auto fades. We don't want autofill. We don't want quantize on. We just want to slice. So that in mind, let's select this event and click apply. And as you can see, everything's sliced. Nothing has changed with the exception to the fact that we have a lot more events to play with now. And they're all right on the transients, which is exactly what we want. So without changing anything, let's go over here into our inspector. All of these events need to be selected for this, but this is where the real exact stuff actually happens. So with all of the events selected, we look over here at our event editor, and right now this big one at the beginning is selected, which actually is kind of a good thing because we can just drag this all the way down. And now all the events are as short as they can be, which means when we bring that control back up, we will be changing the event length for every single one of these events at the same time. The reason that's important is because then they'll be the same length. So let's look at these two right here at the beginning and start scrolling our event end time upward. And you can see they all change at the same time. So what we can do here that will make our lives a little bit easier is to go ahead and set our fade in and fade out time. And I'm going to set the fade in to 1 millisecond and fade out to 30 milliseconds this time, just because I think it sounds better. And if we zoom in, we can go ahead and change these to logarithmic and exponential. Now that helps us out a little bit because we can actually change the event length according to our fade times now. I can just drag this right back to where they meet and we should be pretty much good. So that sounds a lot closer to what we expect out of the DreamGate method. I do still have this event here at the beginning selected, and I'm just going to delete that and select everything else again. Reason being, there is no such thing as trigger pad in Studio One. So whenever we made these slices up here, they all happened exactly where those audio bin points were. The only reason that's an issue is because we could be cutting off a little bit of the transient. So we have this 1 millisecond fade in, and that could be used as a guide when we take our trimmer here and just pull the event out to where we have all of the transient at the beginning. This way, we're not fading anything. We're just allowing a little bit of time for it to ramp up and then give us our transient. So, notably, we'll listen to this ghost note section because now we should be pretty close to what we want. And exactly as I expected, all the events being the same length means that we can hear all the transients for each and every one of those ghost notes, except for this one that I missed apparently. And that's really helpful because now we don't have to worry about not hearing things, and we can actually change the character of each of these hits instead of relying on something like a transient designer. And we already know that every single one of them is there because we edited it manually. The only problem is normalizing these things is going to be a bit of a bear in Studio One. The normalize function, if we check this box, says it's normalized for all these events, but actually what happens is it normalizes the audio clip, not the events. So these little ghost notes are still way down here. And that's a big problem because one of the reasons that we use the DreamGate method is to make a really consistent transient sound. Now this one's really loud and all these are really quiet. So all we've really done is taken the transients out of the original track and left them the same level. Now there's a workaround for this, but it requires a little bit of work beforehand. I have created a macro that will bounce and normalize events and move on to the next one automatically. And I have one that actually does 10 at a time here. So what this does is actually makes a brand new audio file for just each of these events and then clicks the normalize button, which will have like 300 audio files when we're done with this, but they'll all be exactly this length with this fade on it. All these fades and ends will be built into the audio, but we'll be consolidating the file anyway, so maybe it doesn't matter. So we'll select this first one at the beginning here and begin working our way through. I'm going to hit my times 10 button, which will actually bounce and normalize 10 of these events at a time. You can see just that simple. All right, so with all of them bounced and normalized, they should all be the same height, and they are. All these ghost notes are now the same level. And this is why it's important you don't get any false positives when you do transient detection, because if you got like a tom hit, that's going to be really loud now. But we should have all those ghost notes at the same level. And we do. So now I'm just going to drag, select all these, and use Control B to bounce the selection. And you can see all of these hits are the same level. Now I'm just going to pull this level down by about 5 dB or so, just so we don't have them killing us. Now if we compare that to the original track, you can hear that actually we just have transients. That's it. And like we did on the kick, we can go into an EQ. And when we blend that in with the original, we'll get this. And for the ghost note section. It's a little bit wonky, but if I spent a little more time on the editing, I would have gotten that closer. If you want, you can actually just cut this section out and take the level down. So now we have a transient track made from the original audio that is just transients that are all the same level that we can use to reinforce the impact of this drum. So I hope that was helpful, seeing a couple different ways you can do that. Even though I didn't get this section right, but I hope it was at least helpful to see the different ways you can do it the easy way, or what I think is the best way, the Beat Detective / Audio Bin way. And I should have a couple different demos coming out pretty soon. So thanks for sticking around.